1680 BC, bunch of sheep herders gonna invade Africa, called the Shepherd Kings later. The Hebrews that the Africans saved from famine, gave jobs to, befriended, instead of joining the Africans against the invaders from the east, they joined the invaders from the east, became collaborators and clerks for the new rulers of Egypt.
In the 17th century BC, the ancient kingdom of Egypt was suddenly overthrown.
They burned our cities ruthlessly, razed to the ground the temples of the gods, and treated all the natives with cruel hostility.
The Hyksos, a Middle Eastern tribe who had settled among the Egyptians 100 years before, rose against their hosts. Exploiting the death of the pharaoh, they seized power. Egyptian nobles chafed under the Hyksos rule. They looked with scorn upon these intruders who dressed ostentatiously, spoke their language with a strange accent, and dishonored their gods.
1700 BCE, Hyksos ruled Egypt. This is when the Bedouin kings, shepherds, came up out of the country of Mauritania, which is right around where Syria is today, Lebanon. They came and they attacked Egypt. And they ruled in Egypt from 1700 BCE to around 1550 BCE.
This Hebrew migration into Egypt closely parallels Egyptian history when the Semetic Hyksos migrants overthrew the Egyptian pharaohs and seized the throne of Egypt. The Semetic Hyksos kings ruled Egypt for over 100 years.
These were the Asiatics that you see right here. Now, as I mentioned before, the Asiatics who came across the Sinai. So here we see the earliest recording of these people who came in and settled with us for a while, till they built in numbers, and then eventually attacking Egypt. This is again from Khnum-Hotep's tomb from the 12th dynastic period, right during the time of Amenhotep III.
In 1560 BC, Egypt was in crisis. For the first time in history, the kingdom of the ancient pyramid builders was now occupied and divided. Egypt was on the verge of extinction. In the north, a foreign king had invaded and declared himself Pharaoh. His people, the Hyksos, now occupied the rich Nile Delta.
The invasion of the Hyksos to Egypt was really a shock, a surprise, because this is the first time that Egypt was completely invaded. This is the first time that a strange people entered in Egypt and lived for 150 years.
Jacob marries two of his girl cousins and fathers 12 sons. As Jacob ages, Joseph becomes his favorite son, and Dan becomes his venomous son. Jacob eventually takes his sons and his Hebrew clan and migrates from Canaan into Egypt.
Look down here, Jacob took his family to Egypt 1701. They don't tell you that they came into Egypt when Egypt had been attacked, that Jacob, the Hebrews, came out of the same area where the shepherd kings came from, and that's how they got privileges in Egypt.
And when Africa was invaded, 1675 BC, instead of joining the Africans who had been their beneficiary and saved them from starvation, they joined the enemies of Africa. No one has ever returned any favors to us. As a people, we have always been hospitable to strangers, mostly the wrong strangers.
The Egyptian people rebelled against these Semitic kings and pushed them into northern Egypt.
The Egyptian pharaoh vowed to reclaim his country.
One local family was determined to revive Egypt's former glory. The king of Thebes and his two sons, the young princes, Ahmos and his brother Ahmos. The fate not only of their capital Thebes, but Egypt itself lay in their hands.
Essentially, it was a time of great trial for the traditional ruling family of Egypt. There was a feeling that Egypt, as it had been known for the past 1,500 years, could cease to exist.
Ahmos and Ahmos's hatred of the Hyksos was personal.
These are the people who enslaved our people. These people set up in an area of Kemet and Lower Kemet called Avaris, took over, and were enslaving the Africans for over 200 years until Second Enrei of the 17th dynasty, and it is he who waged war on the battlefield, and his life was lost on the battlefield, and it was his son, Ahmos, who continued the battle until his son, Ahmos, who opened up the 18th dynasty. This is a real person, brothers and sisters, who said never again. He was the liberator, the emancipator, who kicked these Hyksos out of our land. This is the real historical account that we've got to start teaching our people, brothers and sisters.
Here you see Second Enrei, 1574 BC, gave his life to free Kemet from the Hyksos. Gave his life. And you see the damage that was done to his skull. He didn't give a damn. He didn't give a damn about the odds. He knew that the freedom of Kemet is not an option.
Their father tried to rebel against the invaders in the north. He paid a terrible price. 3,500 years later, his corpse still bears witness to his brutal slaughter at the hands of the enemy.
The face is grisly, partly because it wasn't well preserved, and there are many, many axe marks all over the head. It must have been a Hyksos struggle, and it must have been fairly bloody.
Traditionally, Egyptians viewed foreigners as primitive and barbaric. For young Ahmos, the death of his father at the hands of the Hyksos must have been humiliating as well as tragic. But now northern Egypt, and even the pyramids, stood on land governed by foreigners.
This was the worst thing to the mind of the Egyptian. The pyramid to Ahmos, to Amosi and Ahmos was a kind of a reminder. Tell them we need the glory of Egypt to come back. And this gave them the power to unite, to defeat those strange people and dismiss them away from Egypt.
With his father dead, his land divided, Ahmos was determined to defeat the Hyksos. His actual words have survived, carved on this large stone, a stela. Ahmos bluntly states his intention to destroy the enemies to the north.
My aim is to liberate Egypt and crush the Asiatics.
But Ahmos could not fight alone. He had to get his people behind him first. And as the stela records, most Thebans did not object to living in a divided Egypt. Ahmos, still only a young boy, watched from the sidelines as his brother Ahmos prepared his army for the fight.
Ahmose and his brother Ahmose would become the liberators, the freedom fighters.
20-year-old Ahmos set off leading his troops north into Hyksos territory. The Egyptian army now headed towards their ultimate goal, Avaris, the Hyksos capital. Ahmos felt confident that victory was in his grasp.
He taunts the king of the Hyksos and shouts to him he's a coward, that he's no good, that he's going to vanquish him.
But Ahmos would not sack Avaris. The records do not say what happened to him. But on the verge of expelling the Hyksos from Egypt, Ahmos died. Egypt's hopes now rested on the shoulders of his 10-year-old brother, Ahmos. Although his mother had lost both her husband and eldest son to the Hyksos, she now groomed Ahmos to continue the war of liberation they had begun.
Ahmose would have been learning the ways of battle, and his mother and courtiers would have been training him to become a great military leader, and he had the example of Ahmose to follow. So he's got to get it right, not only for his own case, but because the nation depends on it.
The pharaoh Ahmoses began to build a new institution in Egypt, a standing army 1,000 strong and growing by the day. Young men were eager to join the army, both to expel the Hyksos and to escape poverty. Success in battle offered the chance of reward. In his new life as a soldier, Ahmos learned the first rule of the military: obedience. He was issued a uniform, short linen kilt and light leather shield, and his hair was shorn to mark him as a soldier and forge a bond with his comrades. In the deserts around Thebes, out of sight of the Hyksos spies who plied the Nile, Ahmos was trained to exhaustion. Braced for a long campaign against an unbeaten adversary, the pharaoh Ahmos gathered his forces at Thebes. He aimed to attack the Hyksos in Avaris, their capital in the Nile Delta. Reaching the marshy delta near the Mediterranean, Ahmos and his comrades disembarked and marched upon the Hyksos strongholds around Avaris.
After 10 years of preparation, Ahmos was ready to take on the Hyksos. It would be his greatest test. The consequences would determine the rest of Egyptian history. Ahmos returned victorious to Thebes. He presented his ceremonial axe to his mother as a symbol of his great victory. The work his father and brother had begun, he had finally completed.
He actually dismissed the Hyksos. His father and grandfather and his brother did start, but he's the one that he actually succeeded to expel the Hyksos away from Egypt.
Ahmos was no longer merely the king of Thebes. He was now pharaoh of a united Egypt.
The reunification of Egypt is crucial. It means a new beginning. It means that Egypt is back to where it should be, as a unified land under the rule of one king, one pharaoh.
It's a seminal moment. It's a beginning moment. There is sometime around maybe 1520 is the opening act in the new kingdom.
The Egyptians were so in awe of Ahmos' victory over the Hyksos that the pharaoh himself was worshipped as a god.
Ahmos, he was a hero. In the eyes of everyone, they were smiling, calling his name, building a chapel for him, asking God to protect him.
And then when our brothers come up out of the south, got strength to kick their ass out, then it said, then there was a pharaoh that knew not Joseph. They don't tell you the whole story though. They don't want to tell you. And this is a Christian publication. So if you get mad at them.
Now right here on these temples here, now you can see documented where we tied them up, roped them, and forced them out of our land. These are the people that we've always had problems with. The problem is we don't understand a historical war. It's a historical war with these people. It's an ancient historical war from the time we've had contact with them.
From the south, every time North Africa is in trouble, a king comes from southern Africa to rescue. Ahmos came up, kicked out the foreigners, and brought the Seti kings to power. And from the Setis would come the mighty 18th dynasty. Now that the foreigners are gone, the Africans looked around and saw the friends of the foreigners. So what you still doing here? Now, but the African in his customary generosity said that those of you who wish to obey African law may stay, though you betrayed me. Those who do not wish to obey African law will have to go. Those who decided they weren't going to obey African law left.
What makes you think that a people have to leave Africa by the sea, pardon to let them out, when there was a 16-mile land bridge, they walked in, why can't they walk out? You need a dramatic, somebody needed a dramatic story to dramatize the myth of their slavery in Africa. When they were actually guests in Africa's home, Africa saved them from hunger. And when they associated themselves with the conquerors of Africa, the Africans said, now you got to go. Now they're going to dramatize it, say they were slaves in Egypt. And anytime anybody said he was slaves in Egypt, ask them what period and under what administration. The period when they were supposed to be slaves was the period when Egypt was conquered from the Western Asia. If they were slaves at all, then I doubt this. They were slaves under foreign domination, and we are not to blame. People can accuse you of having them enslaved with one breath and say the Egyptians were white in the next breath. Now come on, get your lie together.
By 1500 BC, a peace agreement was reached between the Egyptians and the Semetic Hyksos, which allowed the Hyksos people to leave Egypt peaceably and move to Palestine and Jerusalem in the Egyptian-controlled land of Canaan.
And I'm saying that the people we now call Jews entered world history with that visit to Africa.
Yea, he will murder his brother to possess his brother's land. Let him not breed in great numbers, for he will make a desert of his home and yours.
Egyptian history clearly states that the Hyksos who ruled mighty Avaris were Semites like the Israelites, and that they left on a mass exodus, known as the Hyksos expulsion.
We have in the Bible the story of the Semites leaving Egypt and going eastward from Egypt. At the same time, independent of the Bible, we have a story of the Hyksos being expelled from Egypt. I think definitely the two stories are related. They're describing the same event from different viewpoints.
If the Hyksos expulsion and the biblical exodus are really one and the same event, then perhaps we can find the long sought-after proof for the biblical exodus during the Hyksos period.
The Hyksos and the Hyksos expulsion is what we're talking about when we are talking about the Exodus.